Hello, my name is Steve Manock. I'm a family physician. I've served for about the past 30 years in a variety of poor communities in urban, rural, and overseas settings, and currently teach at a family medicine residency program in Texas. So thanks for tuning in. I've been asked to talk a bit about some of the different settings that we might consider serving in to live out our calling to serve the poor through. So that will be the plan over the next 30 minutes. Look at some of those different settings that health professionals can work in. And really, the majority of our time will be looking at some of the joys and challenges that are unique to serving in those different sorts of settings, whether we're in a city, out in a rural area, or overseas. Now, if we were in person, we would have hopefully a lot of time to deal with questions and discuss things together. Unfortunately, we can't do that in this format, but do consider, if you haven't had a chance to attend a CCHF conference in person, do consider doing that in the future, because there really are great opportunities to interact with others with a similar calling. So a couple of presuppositions that we are Christians, and we are Christians who are called to live out the gospel through healthcare among the poor and the marginalized. Now, you might be very solid in this calling. It might be something you're just exploring. You could be a health professions student, or maybe in postgraduate training, or you might be somebody mid-career that's about to make a change. If you're in any of those groups, you're the target audience. So I think it's really amazing as we step back and think how privileged we are that we are really being formed and built according to God's will to really live out the good works, the ministry that God has prepared in advance for us to do it. And that is a tremendous gift, a tremendous privilege. And I want to keep that foremost as we talk through some of the options for service. So, that said, there are really some sincere questions that you might be having. If you're all in on serving the Lord through healthcare, great. Now, where might that be? How should you go about doing that? Who should you be working with? And for many of you, this might involve some preparation for that kind of ministry through health. So I think an important thing to keep in mind as we look about where we might serve, what kind of setting we might serve in, is, here in CCHF, it's a pretty broad group of folks that I think, we have this overarching calling, but there's a lot of paths, and you will see people are serving in a variety of different ways. And so the service is going to look different for different people. It's going to reflect their unique gifts, their unique God-given abilities, their interests, their experiences. And so it doesn't have to look the same. And I think another good thing to keep in mind is that it really is very unusual for someone to serve in the very same place, the same organization, the same sort of role throughout your whole career. So there's probably going to be some transitions along the way. Some you might choose, others might be thrust upon you. But there's a variety of different ways to live out this calling. So I do want to talk a little bit about my own story, in part so that you understand some of my biases on this. But my wife and I, since early on in our marriage, even before we were married, felt called to have a witness for the Lord, that this would be through healthcare among the poor, and that likely that would be cross-culturally. And that was really the basis as we headed into life together of what we saw God leading us to. And that calling was really solidified through college, through medical school. I've been involved with CCHF for many, many years. I was involved in an intervarsity group, did some short-term missions trips. We were a part of an inner-city church. We lived in that community. That was all of these experiences really helped solidify that calling. And then in residency training, I trained in family medicine and chose an urban county hospital for that training because I looked ahead and said, well, if I'm going to be treating poor patients from a variety of cultures in the future, perhaps it's best to train in that same sort of population. And for the first 5 years out of residency, I was involved doing full scope family medicine, meaning inpatient, outpatient, obstetrics, at an urban, church-based, federally qualified health center. So if you're not familiar with federally qualified health centers, these aren't, government organizations, but they're funded very generously by the federal government. So oftentimes, a Christian health ministry will start out maybe as a free clinic, and it might eventually grow, try to raise some funds, and then eventually most end up becoming an FQHC so that they have sort of a more steady funding revenue source, so that they can really care for poor patients. So I did that for 5 years. And then my family and I moved to South America, where I worked at a rural mission hospital, also doing full scope family medicine, inpatient, outpatient, OB. And in addition to the patient care, I was involved in teaching, community health work, got involved in tropical medicine research, and very involved in our local church and the ministries of the local church. And we did that for 10 years. When we came back from overseas, I did, again, full scope family medicine, inpatient, outpatient, OB, actually with C-sections at that point, at a rural FQHC, where I worked with 4 other Christian family docs, plus 9 or 10 nurse practitioners in southern Appalachia. It was also great to work with migrant farm workers there. We had a variety of outreach programs, and I was there for 8.5 years. And, truth be told, after like 24 years or so of working in under-resourced communities and all that full scope family medicine entails, frankly, I was burnt out. I wasn't really sure I could continue to provide health care. We were eager to get back overseas. There were a lot of things we missed about that. So I took a job for a couple of years doing malaria vaccine clinical trials in Central Africa with a small socially conscious biotech startup. Not entirely consistent, perhaps, with our overarching calling, but frankly, I needed a break in some ways for a couple of years. And now for the last just over 5 years, I've been involved with a family medicine residency program, teaching at an urban county hospital, a safety net hospital. I limit my practice to outpatient care, but most of what I do is teach our residents. So, some generalizations, and this will be the bulk of our talk. As far as differences, again, some of the the challenges, some of the joys of urban versus rural versus overseas service. Now, these are generalizations. They are based on my experience. I will say that, when you're doing overseas work, you're going to be rubbing shoulders with a lot of other folks that are doing that. You kind of have that network. And so not only do you have your own experience, but you have, the experience of others that to draw upon. And that's true if you're in rural areas or urban areas also. So I'm not just sharing generalizations based on my personal experience, but also the experience of folks that I know. Now, my goal with talking through some of these differences isn't to, somehow weigh the benefits and challenges of each and say, oh, I'm going to go with the best because, that's going to be the most fulfilling or something. I don't know. It's going to be the easiest. It's important to recognize that all Christian service involves some degree of personal sacrifice. Lots of joys, but lots of tears along the way and difficult situations, particularly serving in poor communities. So again, my goal here is just kind of so you have an idea of what you potentially would be getting into in some of these different sorts of settings. And that hopefully will help you a little bit as far as you make some decisions, as far as making some decisions. One thing I will say, please, 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 if you are called to serve the Lord through healthcare in a poor community, don't settle for something that seems good enough. In other words, if this is a calling on your life, please don't, finish your training and then say, well, this doesn't seem exactly like what the Lord would have for me, but I will be able to treat a few poor patients, here, in this setting, and so maybe that's good enough. I don't think that's going to really work for you long term, and frankly, I think the Lord has something better for you. So let's talk a little bit about urban service. For those of us that treat patients in poor urban communities, we really have a front row seat to the systemic marginalization of urban poor folks and particularly people of color. And, it's difficult. It's really, really hard. You can be in a big city with wonderful medical facilities, and it can be really hard for your patients in the community where you're serving to really get decent health care for a wide variety of reasons. So you will become very much aware of that. Working in these settings, you'll have a tremendous potential for really impacting people's health by providing good, solid health care, helping them to access that care, helping work through some of the barriers that they have to getting those care, really investing in people. So there really is a lot of potential. Even here in the U.S., where people should have pretty decent access to health care. Ideally, in an urban setting, you're going to have availability to specialized care for some of your sicker patients. That is not always the case. You will find that if you're serving in a place where you're serving a lot of uninsured people, it can be very, very difficult for people to get specialized care here in the U.S. And case, most of us find we do a fair amount of advocacy work, really working hard to try to get our patients what they need. A lot of personal contacts, just a lot of work. It shouldn't be as hard as it is, but it's often hard to get people what they need. One issue that I was really kind of surprised about when I worked in an urban setting right out of residency was how much trust issues were a problem. So I'm a white guy. I grew up in the suburbs. I was serving in a predominantly Black and Hispanic community, poor community. And, frankly, a lot of people of color have not had real good experiences with the dominant culture. I guess I kind of thought, I'm here to serve, I'm here to help. And oftentimes it took 2 or 3 visits with somebody before I found that they seemed like they were willing to begin trusting me. So it was a little bit of a surprise, and that's mostly, I've really only experienced that in urban settings here. So violence and crime are definitely part of the experience of people living in poor communities, urban communities in our country. And, personally, those 5 years that we served in an inner city Christian health ministry, I was mugged twice. Our apartment was ransacked and lots of things were robbed once. We had 2 used vehicles that were damaged very significantly. Crime is a part of many of these hard communities, and if you're living in that community and working in that community, it is likely that you will be touched by that. Lots of substance abuse, and that is going to impact a lot of have a big impact on the health of people in urban communities. It's not unique to urban communities, but I think it's probably a little more pronounced in those communities. Now, we've got great ways to address those issues, but be aware that they're very. There are challenges related to relocating, living in the community that you're serving in. I kind of talked a little bit about that as far as some crime issues. But there are a lot of joys as well. And I think, living in a community of need, working on and through the issues of racial reconciliation in particular, challenging things, but as you make those connections, it's really a very, very, very joyful thing, very encouraging thing to do. You can learn a lot and grow a lot through those sorts of. And also, as you're serving there in the trenches with all sorts of folks in that ministry, in those difficult urban settings, there is a whole lot of camaraderie, a lot of fellowship as you're working together. Another advantage, I suppose, is you're really close to mainstream society. So even if you're living in a difficult community, there's a lot of cultural amenities that really aren't too far away, and places that you can kind of escape without going very, very far to recharge a bit. So let's talk a little bit about rural service. So as the term implies, you will be a little ways away from things. So geographically more remote. We've served overseas in a rural area, and then also here in the U.S. But most of the time, even in about the most remote area you can find in the U.S., you're always going to be within a few hours of an airport. So I would suggest anyone who's looking at rural service, the broader spectrum your training can be, the better. because typically you want to provide the broadest spectrum of care you possibly can. We probably don't hear as much as we ought to about the needs in rural areas, but they are profound. There are small hospitals that are closing. There is the lack of specialty care. People are traveling hours to have a baby. There are tremendous needs, and so if you are a well-trained healthcare professional, you can really have a huge impact in rural areas in this. So since you're going to be a ways away from other folks in a rural area, your patients are going to be having a bit harder time accessing some forms of specialty care, even beyond kind of the financial side of things. They might have to travel, an hour or 2 or 3 to see that subspecialist. So if you're providing care to someone, again, it behooves you to begin to get more comfortable, maybe stretch yourself a bit, so that you can provide care so that people don't have to travel so far. Substance abuse in rural areas is a huge issue as well. I think the opioid crisis is affecting everyone, but in southern Appalachia, it remains a huge problem, and something you need to be aware of and work to it. When you're in a rural area, it can be difficult to attract staff. And so having trouble with staff shortages, whether it's physicians or nurses or any people who are doing counseling, social work, it can be difficult to find folks that want to live in a small town in a rural area. And so oftentimes it feels like, in that setting, we're always in recruiting mode. Our experience, and I'm sure this can vary, but was that there was less overt violence and violent crime. There was kind of low-level burglary, whether it was overseas or in southern Appalachia. A lot of domestic violence in both of those settings. So it's not that there's not a crime, it's just not quite as overt and not as you might see. Overt racism was difficult to deal with. Rural Appalachia, it's predominantly white. And frankly, we didn't see a real welcome to immigrants in that setting. It's not universal, but I would say the prevailing attitude was not one of welcome. And we were living in a small community in the South. And I think just in general, people of color were not treated as well and with the respect that they deserve. So that was a little bit difficult to experience that. So one real advantage to serving in rural areas is there's the potential of being situated in an area with a lot of natural beauty. So if you're the person that thrives being close to nature, this might work really well. So there are some unique dynamics to living in small towns. I can remember when we moved to a small town in southern Appalachia. It was a town of about 5,000 people. And we were talking to a realtor, we were looking for a house. And she said, well, everybody will know your business. So if you got nothing to hide, you shouldn't have any problems at all. So there could be a lot less privacy than you might be used to living in an urban setting. And one thing you get good at is the need to play various roles. What do I mean by that? So you won't just be the doctor or the nurse or the pharmacist. You will be a neighbor and a fellow church member. You get good at sort of changing hats. So in other words, what am I trying to say? So as a physician, oftentimes I saw nurses for their health care, nurses that I worked alongside at the hospital. I saw folks from our relatively small church, as patients. I saw my kids' teachers. I treated my next door neighbor when she got admitted to the hospital. I delivered babies for a lady that lived right down the street. So you kind of have to get used to kind of changing hats, in these different relationships. It just takes a little bit of getting used to. It's not a bad thing. I think there's a lot of advantages to it, but just be aware that that's one of the dynamics. So another important thing to keep in mind about rural areas is that if you're married, there may be less options for your spouse. If they're the sort of job they're interested in is not available in that small community. So be aware of that. And also if you relocate to a small community someplace and that position that you're working at doesn't work out, there's not necessarily a whole lot of fallback options for you. Again, these aren't reasons to say no to rural areas. It's just these are some of the dynamics. Okay, let's talk a little bit about serving overseas. So there are tremendous needs overseas. The potential to see much sicker patients than what you might see either in rural or urban areas. In the U.S. And that leads to a lot of heartbreaking situations. I should say that although there are tremendous needs, I was greatly encouraged while we served overseas in seeing relatively straightforward interventions, antibiotics, IV fluids, a safe delivery, a pretty straightforward surgery could really make a huge impact. But there are times when the finances or the availability of treatment or even some cultural issues put barriers up that mean that people die or are disabled seemingly needlessly. So it can be difficult. Used to, I'm not sure we ever really do. There are oftentimes greater cultural or language hurdles to deal with, but much like issues of involved in relocation or reconciliation in communities here in the U.S., there's a lot of joy in learning and understanding and being understood as you overcome. Most folks who serve in healthcare overseas are probably going to have to raise support. There are a couple of denominations that still provide some, like a salary to serving overseas, but most of us who have served overseas, we had to raise support, and the income is going to be considerably less. But by the same token, cost of living in many places in the developing world is a whole lot less than here in the U.S. So this shouldn't make you say, no, I'm not going to do it because I can't raise support. I mean, God provides for folks through all sorts of sources and all sorts of places. So don't let that scare you, but just be aware that that's one of the realities. You will likely be far from family and friends unless you happen to be have some, your friends there serving with you or family members serving with you, which some folks do when they serve as health. There tends to be a pretty high turnover. That's been our experience. Oftentimes people will come for 2-3 years and then they're gone. More common might be 5 to 7 years and then they're gone. And so that's kind of a constant turnover that we wouldn't expect necessarily in setting. I do think, once again, that the issues of camaraderie and fellowship are increased, particularly as folks are living out in more isolated areas. So the camaraderie with the team that you're working with. One potential struggle is our issues of political instability or seemingly arbitrary dealings with government authorities. You think you've got everything figured out, and then the rules change. I'm not saying that can't happen here in the U.S., but I think it's more of a common issue. So we do a lot of pivoting, and we do a lot of trying to maintain good relationships with government authorities, but occasionally there are surprises that could have big impacts on our ability to serve. A lot of folks think if you're going to be a medical missionary, if you're going to be serving in a Christian health ministry overseas, that's great because you will have a great verbal witness for the Lord. That's not actually always the case, and so that's important to recognize. Many places, yes, you can share the gospel, clearly with folks. Beyond your healthcare ministry, but there's a lot of places you can't, and so keep that in mind. I think in the latter category, we see healthcare missions as a way to open doors for spiritual conversations, maybe a little less overt, a little more in private. So there's different ways to handle that. So in the last couple of minutes that we have, just in general, some advice on training. Do try to get the broadest spectrum training you can, because again, if you're going to an area of a lot of need, that's going to serve you well. And the broadest spectrum of training possible, but still in keeping with your gifts and interests. So not everyone is called to be a family physician or, a nurse that does it all. But if you are interested in serving poor folks, it is helpful, as I say, to get broad spectrum training. If not, hey, be the greatest pediatrician or OBGYN or general surgeon or pediatric nurse that you can be, if that's how God has really gifted you. For those of you entering postgraduate training, I think it is helpful to focus on caring for the same sorts of patients during your training that you anticipate serving in the future. And going to a place where there's like-minded faculty and fellow trainees is going to be very, very helpful, so that you don't get diverted off into something that really isn't consistent with your calling. So, and then also when you're all through with your training, or maybe you're currently considering other opportunities to have more of a ministry in poor communities, I've got a little bit of advice for you if I can. So try to avoid the square peg in round hole phenomenon. In other words, you really want an organization, you want to serve with an organization whose mission is matching your calling. It can be very, very hard if you say, you go to someone and you try to have them change, that organization change what they're doing to fit your calling. That's going to be a bit of an uphill climb. There are very, very few private practices or private healthcare systems that are set up to serve poor people. They are out there, but they're very, very few. And that's what I'm saying. If you finish your training and you go into sort of a private practice kind of a setting, it's going to be really, really hard to focus on caring for poor patients. More likely, you're going to be looking at either a mission hospital or a clinic, charitable clinics, free clinics, these federally qualified health centers, county hospitals and county clinics. These are really the folks that are going to be focusing on this sort of care, and that's probably where you're going to find a home and be able to thrive in your. And then a question that I've posed to folks as I explore different opportunities, especially in an organization that's not overtly Christian, is, can I pray with patients? The response you get to that question is going to be very, very telling. If that makes people very nervous, probably not a good sign. If that's received very warmly, that's a very good sign if you want to have a spiritual component to what you're doing with your patients. And then finally, as you're looking for positions, there are issues of conscience, and these, I'm talking about a variety of issues here. But there might be certain areas of your practice, of the care that's being provided, that are a little more controversial, or cause some kind of moral or ethical conflicts potentially. So the question is, are you in full agreement with what's happening in that setting? And if not, if you're not in full agreement with everything that's happening, is this the sort of setting where a plurality of views is embraced, not just tolerated, but embraced? So if you have strong feelings about certain relatively controversial issues, will those be accepted? And oftentimes these are around issues of reproductive health care in particular, but there's other areas as well that you want to make sure that you're well aligned. So just a few words about Christian organizations. I really can't overstate the potential advantages of the shared vision, mission, and fellowship that you'll have if you serve with like-minded believers. Some of these organizations really are a lot like religious orders. You're going to be serving together. Sometimes you're living together. You're oftentimes worshiping together. And that can be wonderful. Some folks like a little distance from the people that they're working with, and it might not work out quite so well. So there are some potential pitfalls, I think, to Christian organizations, and I say this with as much humility and grace as I can. But some can be very dogmatic about certain issues. So it's good to sort of get a feel for how they feel about things. I think those of us that work or have worked in Christian healthcare settings, we need to guard against self-righteousness. It can be very hard to look around at the rest of the society and even the church and say, hey, why aren't you folks more excited and dedicated to doing the sort of work that we're doing? So do be a little bit careful. Leadership issues, this is probably a whole nother talk, probably better for leaders, but it's important to figure out what leadership is like. Is it authoritarian? Again, or if is this the sort of organization where maybe there's a leader that's not only your boss, but it's also your pastor and your landlord? How does that all work? So it's good to get an idea about what kind of leadership is there at that organization. So a few final takeaways. I hope the main message here is that we really, as healthcare workers, have a lot of different ways that we can live out our calling to serve among the poor in urban, rural, and overseas communities. There's unique challenges and joys to each of those. Do recognize that Christian service absolutely involves some degree of sacrifice, but it really is hopefully our goal to see how our individual gifts, abilities, and interests can be used for His kingdom through healthcare. So thanks so much for listening. I hope this was helpful.